Hello and welcome to another episode of Drawing Commentary. This drawing is going to be in a more traditional architectural visualization style, or when I say traditional, I guess I really mean old school, because this is a style that I used a lot, like in the late 1980s, to do pen and paper renderings of architectural designs, where pen and ink is used on paper to do all the outlines, and then it's colored in usually with markers. Now I'm still doing all of my pen and ink line work on paper, scanning it, and then coloring it in Photoshop. And these days, this kind of a sketching style might be used in a very preliminary part of a project. In this case, the project is for building that appears in a video game, specifically a game that would take place in the territories of the Middle East war, like the war in Syria and Afghanistan and stuff. So it's kind of a Middle Eastern desert architecture, but it's really just to lay out design principles, just to show the client this is kind of the general direction. These are the very general architectural features I'm thinking of, but the client will probably look at this for about 5 seconds and either say, yeah, great, develop it, or no, I was thinking of something else, let's toss it and start over. But the time budget for this drawing is about an hour and a half. So laying out the design and doing all of the line work has already taken up about half an hour, and I have about an hour left to render in all of the textures and colors and stuff like that, and indications of materials. So really, if the client says, now let's toss this one and start over, I've only lost about, the budget has only been burned up by about an hour and a half. That's not such a big deal. And really, both in architectural visualization and in visualization for such things as video game design, a more comprehensive visualization of the design will not really be in this style. This style is much too loose and much too kind of the black and white line works obviously makes it look like a drawing, and in video game design, the most important thing is really to convey what kind of mood and atmosphere is going on, and this is not really doing that so much because it's too hand-drawn looking. And similarly, in architectural visualization, you're really gonna be doing this kind of stuff in 3D. If you're an architectural visualization person, you're pretty much going to be using something like 3D Studio Max most of the time. There's a few niche markets. I still see some architectural visualizers who are doing things in like watercolor and stuff, but that's pretty much a dying breed. But anyway, back to this drawing. I would say really I'm about like 10 minutes into the drawing, and I would say 90% of the drawing is done. Everything else is just kind of fine-tuning stuff, but the whole atmosphere, the way the building is lit, the volumes, the general color family is all put in place, and most people could look at this and pretty much get a good idea of what's going on. There's a lot of, if you really look at some of the smaller details, a non-artistic eye might still have some doubts, but it's it's pretty much all there, and that's how I prefer to work. And I think if anyone who's really working under a tight deadline pressure is going to want to work that way, where you get all the big stuff laid in first and then start putting in the smaller stuff based on how much time you'll have left over in your time budget. And what I'm doing right now is fine-tuning the way that light works, or fine-tuning the illusion of how light works in space, where you're starting to see like everything has gradations, every color, even though that shaded side of the building looks just sort of like a cool brown color, you can see pretty clearly that there's tons of variations of brown and tan and purple happening in there. And same thing with the lit side of the building. There's a light tan color, but there's all sorts of different tan colors that I'm starting to lay in. And that's all for very specific reasons and with very specific strategy, which has to do with the way that the human eye / brain organ interprets perception. So if you went outside to the street and looked at the side of the building, your first impression might be, well, it's just all one color. But if you really start to study how the eye and brain process all of the information that your eye is taking in, you'll see a few things going on. Like if you look at the corner of the building, especially the upper corner, that the lit side of the building is bright, but it gets even brighter as it gets to the corner. And similarly, the dark side of the building gets even darker as it approaches that corner. So the lightness is becoming lighter and the darkness is becoming darker as they approach that corner. And that's mimicking the way that the brain actually interprets data that come in from the eyeball. The brain kind of puts little exaggerations in there so that you can instantly see how space is working and how information, how light is happening. You don't need to spend a lot of time pondering what you see and trying to figure out what it is that you're seeing. The brain sort of creates this shorthand and exaggerates everything, so corners are even sharper than they should be, and shadows and light are all slightly exaggerated. And the process of drawing, at least the process of this drawing, is a way of mimicking that and making a caricature, making everything even more exaggerated. And another specific thing that I'm exaggerating is if you look at the cast shadow towards the left of the drawing, you can see that the shadow is kind of a blue color, which it's reflected light from the sky, which is blue. And if you look at the underside of those arches in the shaded side of the building, they're more of a brownish tan color, and that's light being reflected from the ground, being reflected up, which generally, if you just look at things in the real world, you might not really notice that unless you're really looking for it. But in a drawing, I sort of have to exaggerate all of that just so that it everything looks like reality, but in the drawing it's all kind of a hyper reality. And if I were doing a very highly rendered drawing that might take like 4 or 5 hours to do, all of those things would be a lot more subtle. I'm making these kinds of plays of light really garish and cartoony because I want my client to look at that and understand instantly what's going on, and to make a decision almost instantly about whether or not it's on the right track. And as a result, everything is just a little bit more garish than I would really want it to be, but that's the name of the game if you have like 45 minutes to complete all of this coloring work. And since I stated that the purpose of this drawing is to immediately give an idea of two things: one, the color families, and two, the materials being used in this asset. The other thing that I'm doing right here now is starting to give indicators of material, and since this is Photoshop, I'm going to be using all of the quick and dirty shortcuts that I know about, which in this case is I'm taking photographs of textures and just slapping them onto my drawing. Usually I'll either make those textures kind of transparent, like I'll reduce the transparency of the layer of like that brick texture that I put down earlier to maybe like 30%, or I will change the blend mode of that layer to usually soft light, just so it's a very subtle indication of a, in this case, brick texture, but I want my light and shadow modeling that I did previously to shine through that texture and not get, I don't want the texture to just dominate the drawing. It needs to be a very secondary quality in the drawing. And now again, some exaggeration. You can see that like where the sunlight is shining through the arches on that wall to the right, I'm adding like a bleed of reflected light coming up, which is again much more intense than it really should be. In fact, I don't really, that patch of sunlight through that archway, it almost looks as if there's a light source in there that's shining at you. It's just a little bit too much, but again, since this is a 45-minute long sketch, I'm gonna err to the side of too much exaggeration rather than spending a lot of time kind of fine-tuning stuff. And I'm going back now to what I just mentioned, where my lights and shadows are even more exaggerated than they would be in reality, and I'm adding even more blue to that shadowed wall, and I'll start adding even more brightness to the lit wall. And another thing you can see that I did a little while ago is on those cast shadows, on the edge of the cast shadows of those columns and the cast shadows of the building on the street, I've added a very slight red border to that, which is again super exaggerated, almost cartoony exaggerated, but it's just an indication of when waves of light go around a corner, they're going to be refracted just like light going through a prism. So the spectrum of visible light is going to be kind of slightly, very slightly bent into a rainbow. So I'm just hinting that some of those red lights from visible light are starting to bleed over that shadow edge, and it's probably not something you'd be able to see if you actually looked at a building, but it's just another exaggeration that just sort of adds a little bit of color and variety, and sort of it looks like there's something interesting going on, even though you'd be hard pressed to really see that in the real world. And you can kind of see at the top parapet of the building there's brush strokes that are bleeding right out of the line work. And generally, like the buildings on the side of the drawing are scarcely more than just one flat color, and you can see just a lot of, towards the side of the drawing, there's just a lot of brush strokes that are not even in the lines, and those edges are just really sloppy. And I'm doing that for a reason, because in the center of the drawing, I'm putting a lot of very intense detail. Like you can see right now, I'm putting all of those groceries and products inside of the storefront, and adding all sorts of like vegetables or I don't know what those are, but just adding very detailed texture in there in the center, in the middle of the drawing, and yet on the sides of the drawing, it's scarcely more than one flat color. And I'm doing that for another very specific perceptual reason, which is that the way that the human eye and brain organize information is that whatever you're looking at right in front of you is almost like looking at something through a telephoto lens. Like everything is dominating your perception, whereas things out to the periphery start to, like, you're aware that that stuff is there on your peripheral vision, but you're not perceiving a lot of information about what's out there. And you can sort of see that happening, like if you see the moon just rising over the horizon, it looks gigantic because your eye is like focusing on just those buildings around there. But if you take a picture of the moon over the horizon, it's usually going to look like really disappointing. It's like really small because the camera is seeing everything in the environment with equal importance, whereas your eye is kind of amplifying things in front of you, which I'm not like a neurologist, so my explanation is like really kind of rudimentary, but the idea is that if you put a lot of detail in the part of the drawing that you want to focus in on, the viewer will think, wow, there's a lot of information here, and they'll completely forget about the fact that on the sides of the drawing there might be almost nothing there whatsoever, and they'll still think, yeah, that drawing looks complete, even though you can see right there that those buildings on the very sides almost look like a little kid's crayon drawing, but nobody cares about those. And what I'm doing here is just adding a little bit more texture. This is going to eventually appear in a video game, and I have no idea what the actual environment is going to be, so I don't know if there's going to be grass or pavement or asphalt that's surrounding this building. Doesn't really matter. I just want to show that there's some context, that it's not just kind of floating in this gray space, but I'm just grabbing stuff from photos that I took from the internet or scanned off of magazines or something. And eventually those photographs, just like the photograph at the very beginning of this video, most of those photographs are going to be completely obliterated by the time I'm done with it. It's just to add a very slight hint of texture and a very slight hint of random color variation, so that the viewer gets that there's stuff going on. But if the viewer really scrutinized that ground plane, they wouldn't really have any specific information. And you might have noticed with my brushes, like the brushes I'm using right now, and that brush that creates that sort of pebbly finish, those are some sort of brushes from Kyle's brushes, which is Kyle is a guy who generates Photoshop brush sets and sells them. You can go to kylesbrushes.com to check those out. I've just started playing around with those just for fun. Like I don't know if I'll continue using them, but it's nice to just have a few new kind of techniques in my bag of tools to try out new things. So I like to just find new stuff on the internet and new tutorials and things, just to sort of keep my technique and my artistic vocabulary growing and changing, because I've found usually, like, as a commercial artist, you almost need to like reinvent yourself about every 5 years or so. Otherwise you become non-competitive. So I always like to change up my style a little bit and try out new things. Some of it works, some of it doesn't, but if I keep doing the same stuff year after year, I will eventually find myself out of work, because other people will just be coming up with newer and cooler techniques that are more in demand, and eventually clients will just like stop wanting my sort of look and feel. So I think one thing that's very important is to just always try out new stuff. Like, I think with this drawing, I actually might have gone over my budgeted time just to try out like those new brushes, just to try out some new ways of rendering texture. And if it doesn't work, it's not a big deal, but if it does work, I can incorporate that into my bag of tricks and have some new kind of stylistic ventures to play with next time I do this kind of drawing. So this drawing is done. It took, according to my video recording time, it took about 40 minutes to draw. Again, this is like a very rough sketch that the client should not be looking at for more than about 5 seconds, and then it's served its purpose. And then if the client likes this, it would go on to a more buttoned up rendering. And or if the client doesn't like it, it gets tossed. But I haven't lost a lot of time, no more than about 40 minutes, and that's not such a big deal. So I hope you've gotten a few tips or inspirations from watching this video, and I will talk to you next time. All right, bye.